The year is 1940. Brooklyn is drowning in a November downpour. But inside a towering brownstone on Montague Street, the air is drier than a tomb and twice as cold. They say love is eternal, but in New York City, some betrayals are so profound they refuse to be buried with the body. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to the rustle of silk and the smell of rotting gardenias, only to see a figure standing at the foot of your bed. A woman in a tattered wedding dress, her face hidden behind a veil that drips not with rain, but with sorrow. She isn't looking for her groom. She is looking for a life to replace the one stolen from her. Tonight, the shadows in the corner of the room are not empty. Something is waiting in the dark, and it is wearing white. New York City, late autumn 1940. The Great Depression is waning, but the city still holds its breath as war drums beat across the ocean. In the dimly lit office of Kane Bones, the only light comes from the glowing embers of a cigarette and the neon sign blinking erratically outside the frosted glass. Kane Bones is not a typical private eye. He doesn't chase cheating husbands or missing jewelry. He walks the thin, gray line between the living and the dead. He is the man you call when the police are baffled, when the priests are terrified, and when the things that go bump in the night start screaming. Tonight's case takes him across the bridge to Brooklyn Heights, to a prestigious neighborhood where secrets are kept behind heavy velvet curtains. A frantic father, a terrified daughter, and a house with a history that bleeds through the wallpaper. They call her the Phantom Bride, a spirit said to roam the halls searching for something she lost decades ago. But Kane knows that spirits don't just wander, they hunt. As the rain lashes against the cobblestones, Kane grabs his coat and his kit. He knows that to save the living, he must first confront the rage of the dead. This isn't just a ghost story. It is a rescue mission. Leave your like and subscribe. Tell me here in the comments from which city and country you are watching this story. I will love to know how far these stories are reaching. The rain outside Kane Bones' office on 42nd Street was not merely falling. It was assaulting the city, washing the grime of 1940 into the gutters of Hell's Kitchen. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the lingering ozone of the neon sign buzzing just outside the frosted glass window. It was late, past the hour when honest men were in bed, but Kane Bones was rarely accused of being an honest man in the traditional sense. He was a watcher of the dark. When the knock came, it was frantic, a rhythmic pounding that spoke of terror rather than courtesy. Kane didn't look up from his glass of bourbon as he called out, "It's unlocked." The man who stumbled in was dripping wet, his expensive wool trench coat soaked through to the lining. He was a man of stature, clearly wealthy, perhaps a banker or a titan of industry, but in this moment he was reduced to a trembling wreck. He introduced himself as Arthur Vance, a name that Kane recognized from the society pages of the New York Times. Vance was 56, with graying temples and eyes that looked like shattered glass. He didn't take the seat offered. Instead, he paced the small rug in front of Kane's desk,
wringing his hat in his hands as water pooled on the floorboards. "Mr. Bones, they told me you were the only one who wouldn't laugh at me," Vance began, his voice cracking. "I have been to the doctors, I have been to the priests at St. Anne's. The doctors say it's hysteria, the priests say to pray. But prayer isn't working, and medicine is useless against what is in my house." Kane took a slow drag of his cigarette, the embers illuminating his scarred face. "Sit down, Mr. Vance. Tell me about the house, and tell me about the girl." Vance collapsed into the leather chair. He spoke of his daughter, Margaret Vance. She was 23, a vibrant, modern young woman who loved jazz and had just become engaged to a promising young lawyer. But since the engagement party 2 weeks ago, Margaret had vanished, not physically, but spiritually. It started with the cold. Vance described how the brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, usually a fortress of warmth, had developed pockets of air so frigid they could freeze water in a glass, specifically in the hallway leading to Margaret's room. Then came the smell, a cloying, overwhelming scent of rotting gardenias, not fresh flowers, but the smell of a funeral parlor where the bouquets have been left too long. "But last night was the end," Vance whispered, leaning in. "I heard weeping. I went to her room. She was standing on the balcony, Mr. Bones, in the pouring rain. She was wearing a dress, an old wedding dress, tattered, covered in lace that looked ancient. It wasn't hers. She was screaming a name, Elias. She screamed it over and over until her throat bled. When I tried to pull her inside, she looked at me, but those weren't my daughter's eyes. They were old. They were filled with 40 years of hate." Vance buried his face in his hands. "She isn't Margaret anymore. Something has peeled her away and stepped inside her skin." Kane extinguished his cigarette. He didn't need to hear more to know this wasn't a case of mental illness. This was a displacement, a hostile takeover of a living vessel.
The drive across the Brooklyn Bridge was a journey into the mouth of the storm. The Hudson River churned black and violent below them. Kane sat in the passenger seat of Vance's Packard, his eyes scanning the skyline. Brooklyn Heights in 1940 was a neighborhood of old money and older secrets, a place where the Victorian era refused to die quietly. The streets were lined with gas lamps that flickered weakly against the wind. When the car finally pulled up to the Vance residence on Montague Street, Kane felt the change in atmospheric pressure immediately. It wasn't just the storm. It was the house itself. The structure was a 4-story brownstone, imposing and severe, with ivy crawling up the brickwork like dark veins. The windows were dark, save for a single light burning on the 3rd floor, the beacon of the sick room. As Kane stepped onto the pavement, he felt a low hum vibrate through the soles of his shoes. It was a subsonic frequency, the kind of spiritual resonance that usually indicated a tragedy had been replaying itself in a loop for decades. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the iron medallion he always carried. It was already warm to the touch. The entity inside was aware of his arrival. The front door was opened by the housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins. She was a woman of 62, with a face etched by years of stoic service, but tonight she was terrified. She held a silver crucifix so tightly her knuckles were white. "She's been pacing, up and down. The scratching, sir, the scratching on the walls is getting louder." Kane stepped into the foyer. The interior was opulent, filled with mahogany furniture and Persian rugs, but the air was stale and heavy. It felt like walking into a mausoleum. "Mrs. Higgins," Kane said, his voice low and commanding, "has the temperature fluctuated in the kitchen?" The woman nodded rapidly. "The icebox is warmer than the pantry, and the neighborhood cats are all sitting on the garden wall, staring at Miss Margaret's window. They haven't moved in hours." Kane walked to the grand staircase. He placed his hand on the banister. Instantly, a flash of emotion hit him. Not his own, but a projected memory. He felt a crushing weight in his chest, a sensation of betrayal so sharp it nearly winded him. He saw a fleeting image in his mind's eye, a letter falling to the floor, a hand trembling, a diamond ring being thrown across the room. The house had absorbed the trauma. The walls had eyes, and the floorboards had memories. This wasn't just a haunting. The house was a battery, storing 40 years of pain, and now it was discharging that energy into Margaret Vance. Kane looked up the spiraling staircase into the darkness above. "The entity is bound to the structure," Kane muttered to himself. "It's not just passing through. It lives here, and it thinks this is still its home."
The climb to the 3rd floor felt like wading through deep water. The air grew denser and colder with every step. By the time Kane and Arthur reached the landing, their breath was visible in white plumes, despite the heating system rattling in the basement. The door to Margaret's room was closed, but the sounds emanating from behind it were unmistakable. It sounded like fabric being torn, mixed with a low, rhythmic sobbing that made the skin on Kane's neck crawl. Arthur hesitated, his hand trembling on the knob. Kane gently moved him aside and pushed the door open. The room was spacious, dominated by a large 4-poster bed, but all the normalcy of a young woman's sanctuary had been stripped away. The mirrors were draped in black cloth, Mrs. Higgins doing, likely, but one had slipped, revealing a crack that ran diagonally across the glass. In the center of the room stood Margaret Vance. She was skeletal, her skin the color of parchment, her eyes sunken into dark bruises of exhaustion. She was wearing a silk nightgown, but she moved as if she were wearing heavy brocade. She didn't look at her father. Her eyes locked onto Kane. "You are not the groom," she rasped. The voice was wrong. It was too deep, layered with a harsh metallic distortion, like a phonograph record played at the wrong speed. "The groom is coming. I must be ready." Kane stepped into the room, his eyes scanning for the anchor point. In the corner stood a dressmaker's mannequin. On it was Margaret's actual wedding dress, a modern 1940s satin gown. But hovering over it, visible only to Kane's trained sight, was a spectral overlay, a phantom dress of lace and intricate beadwork, Victorian in style. The entity was projecting its own memories onto reality. "Margaret," Kane said softly, stepping forward. "She is not here," the thing using Margaret's mouth hissed. Suddenly, the room erupted. The heavy velvet curtains slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. A perfume bottle on the vanity rose into the air and hurled itself at Kane's head, shattering against the wall inches from his ear. The scent of rotting gardenias exploded in the room, choking them. "Leave us," the voice shrieked. Margaret's body contorted, her back arching at an unnatural angle. She fell to her knees, clawing at the floorboards. He promised he would come." The temperature plummeted further. Frost, web patterns rapidly forming on the window panes. Kane grabbed a pouch of salt and iron filings from his trench coat and quickly cast a circle around the girl. As the salt hit the floor, sparks flew as if it were touching a live wire. Margaret screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and collapsed within the circle, panting like a wild animal. The entity was strong, much stronger than Kane had anticipated. It wasn't just a ghost, it was a poltergeist fueled by a broken heart, the most dangerous fuel of all.
Leaving Arthur to watch over his unconscious daughter, Kane retreated to the library on the ground floor. The house was quieter now, but it was a deceptive silence, like the eye of a hurricane. Kane needed information. Ghosts obeyed rules. They were bound by their history, their trauma, and their names. To exercise this spirit, he needed to know exactly who she was, and more importantly, why she was still here. He picked up the heavy black telephone and dialed a number he knew by heart, the private line of Detective Sullivan at the 84th Precinct, a man who owed Kane a few favors. "Sully, it's Bones. I need you to dig into the archives. I'm at 14 Montague Street. I need the history of the owners, specifically around the turn of the century. Look for a wedding that didn't happen. Look for a suicide. And look for the name, Elias." While he waited, Kane poured himself a drink from Vance's crystal decanter. He prowled the library, pulling books on Brooklyn genealogy. Vance entered the room, looking like a ghost himself. "Did you find anything?" Arthur asked weakly. "Not yet," Kane replied, "but the spirit mentioned a groom. She's stuck in a loop, Mr. Vance. She thinks today is her wedding day. The engagement of your daughter triggered it. The energy of a new bride woke up the old one." The phone rang. Kane snatched it up. It was Sullivan. "Kane, you sure know how to pick 'em," the detective's voice crackled over the line. "I found it. 1902. The house was owned by the D'Amico family, Italian shipping magnates. They had a daughter, Isabella. Beautiful girl, 20 years old. She was set to marry a man named Elias Thorne, a financier from Chicago." "Let me guess," Kane said, watching the smoke from his cigarette curl into the air. "He never showed up." "Worse," Sullivan replied. "Thorne was a con artist. He skipped town the morning of the wedding with Isabella's dowry, $50,000 in gold certificates, and he took Isabella's younger sister with him. Double betrayal. Isabella went mad, locked herself in the third-floor bedroom. She starved herself, Kane. Took her weeks to die. Rumor has it she swallowed arsenic at the very end, just to speed it up. They found her in her wedding dress, clutching a silver locket he gave her." Kane thanked him and hung up. The picture was complete. Isabella D'Amico, betrayed by her lover and her sister, left to rot in the very room Margaret now slept in. The rage had been festering for 38 years, baking into the bricks, waiting for a catalyst. Margaret's happiness had been the insult that woke the dead. Isabella didn't just want to possess Margaret. She wanted to be Margaret. She wanted to reclaim the youth and the wedding she was denied. Kane looked at Arthur. "We know her name. Isabella, and we know what she's waiting for. She's waiting for Elias. We have to show her he's never coming back." Kane returned to the third floor with a grim determination. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, the witching hour. The atmosphere in the hallway had shifted from cold to suffocating. It felt as though the air pressure had doubled, pressing against their eardrums.
Cain carried a silver bowl filled with water from the kitchen tap, a box of white candles, and a small vial of holy oil he kept for extreme cases. He entered Margaret's room. The girl was awake now, sitting bolt upright in the center of the bed. Her eyes were wide, staring at nothing. Her pupils dilated so much her eyes appeared entirely black. Cain motioned for Arthur to stay by the door. "Do not interfere. No matter what you see, she will try to use your love for your daughter against you." Cain set the silver bowl on the floor at the foot of the bed. He arranged 3 candles in a triangle around it, the shape of containment. He lit them, the matches flaring brightly before settling into a steady, unnatural blue flame. The room fell silent. The wind outside ceased to howl. The rain stopped tapping against the glass. It was a vacuum of sound. "Isabella D'Amico," Cain spoke, his voice steady and grounded. "I know you are there. I know you are listening." Margaret's head snapped toward him with the speed of a striking cobra. A smile spread across her face, but it was a smile of malice, stretching the skin too tight. "You know my name," the entity whispered. The voice echoed from the corners of the room, not just from Margaret's lips. "But you do not know my pain. Are you the priest? Did Elias send you to confess his sins?" "Elias is dead, Isabella," Cain said, stepping closer to the salt circle. "He died a long time ago. He isn't coming." The reaction was violent. The bed frame lifted 3 inches off the floor and slammed down with a crash that shook the house. The candles flickered wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws on the walls. "Liar!" the entity screamed. Margaret's body convulsed. "No! No! No!" Cain moved forward, chanting a binding incantation in Latin, trying to stabilize the girl's body before the spirit tore it apart from the inside.
The room became a cyclone of supernatural energy. The heavy oak wardrobe began to rock back and forth, threatening to tip over. Books flew off the shelves, pages flapping like panicked birds. Cain was hit in the shoulder by a flying heavy brass lamp, the pain shooting down his arm, but he didn't break his stance. He knew that if he showed fear, the entity would win. Margaret was no longer in control. Isabella had assumed full command of the motor functions. The girl stood up, breaking the invisible barrier of the salt circle with a burst of kinetic energy that sent Cain stumbling backward. She moved with a disjointed, puppet-like gait, her limbs jerking unnaturally. She walked toward the window, her hands reaching out to the storm that had started up again outside. "The carriage," she muttered, her voice oscillating between a whisper and a scream. "I must see if the carriage is here." She began to tear at her own face, her fingernails digging into Margaret's soft skin, drawing beads of blood. She was trying to peel off the mask of Margaret to reveal Isabella underneath. "Arthur, the box!" Cain shouted over the roar of the wind inside the room. "The anchor! She died clutching a locket. It has to be in the house." Arthur, paralyzed by fear near the door, blinked. We cleared out the attic years ago. There was a box of old junk, things the previous owners left behind. We didn't think it mattered." "Get it!" Cain roared, struggling to hold Margaret back as she tried to throw herself through the glass doors of the balcony. "Go now!" Arthur scrambled out of the room. Cain tackled Margaret onto the bed. Her strength was inhuman. She threw him off like a rag doll.
He crashed into the vanity, the mirror finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. Kane tasted blood in his mouth. He scrambled up, grabbing the iron poker from the fireplace. He didn't want to hurt the girl, but he had to contain the spirit. Isabella turned to him, her face a mask of fury. She raised a hand, and Kane felt invisible fingers wrap around his throat, squeezing the air out of his windpipe. He clawed at his neck, gasping, his vision swimming with black spots. The ghost was strangling him with telekinetic force. "You will not stop the wedding!" Isabella hissed, walking closer to him. "No one stops the wedding!" Kane fell to his knees, his lungs burning. He needed Arthur. He needed that locket. If they didn't find the physical object binding her to this plane, Kane Bones was going to die in this room. Just another victim of the Montague Street house.
Just as Kane's vision began to fade into blackness, the door burst open. Arthur Vance stumbled in, clutching a dusty, rotting wooden box. He tripped, spilling the contents across the floor. Old letters, dried rose petals that disintegrated into dust, and a tarnished black-silver locket on a rusted chain. As soon as the locket hit the floor, the grip on Kane's throat vanished. He gasped, sucking in greedy gulps of air. The room went unnaturally still. Margaret, or Isabella, froze. She turned slowly, her eyes fixated on the silver object lying on the Persian rug. It was the heart of the haunting, the object she had died holding, the object that contained all her love and all her hate. Mine, the entity whimpered. Margaret's body dropped to its knees, crawling toward the locket. Kane lunged. He was faster. He snatched the locket from the floor. It was freezing cold, burning his hand like dry ice. The metal vibrated violently in his palm. He scrambled backward, putting the burning candles between him and the possessed girl. "Give it to me!" Isabella screamed, her voice distorting into a demonic growl. The shadows in the room elongated, reaching for Kane. "Arthur, the holy water!" Kane shouted. He fumbled with the clasp of the locket. It was rusted shut. He used his thumbnails, prying it open until it snapped. Inside was a small sepia-toned photograph of a man with a mustache, Elias Thorne, the face of the betrayer. Kane held the open locket up so the entity could see it. "Look at him, Isabella. Look at the man who killed you." Margaret screamed, covering her eyes, but she couldn't look away. The truth was a weapon. Kane flicked his lighter open. The flame danced near the tiny photograph. "He is gone. You are holding on to a ghost of a ghost. Let go." Kane touched the flame to the dry paper inside the locket. It caught fire instantly. The entity let out a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of metal tearing, of a soul being ripped from its mooring. As the picture burned, Kane dropped the flaming locket into the silver bowl of holy water. The moment the hot metal hit the water with a loud hiss, the explosion of energy knocked both Kane and Arthur to the floor. A shockwave of white light blasted outward from the bowl, illuminating every corner of the room, banishing the shadows. The temperature skyrocketed, the freezing cold replaced instantly by a rush of warm air. Margaret arched her back one last time, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. From her mouth a white mist poured out. It coalesced in the center of the room, forming the faint, translucent outline of a woman in a Victorian wedding dress. She was beautiful, sad, and transparent. She looked at Kane, then at the smoking bowl of water. The rage was gone from her face, replaced by a profound, centuries-old exhaustion. She looked at Arthur, then down at Margaret's unconscious body. The spirit of Isabella D'Amico bowed her head slowly. She began to fade, turning into motes of light that drifted upward, passing through the ceiling, dissolving into the ether. The heavy atmosphere of the house lifted instantly. The oppressive weight that had been on Kane's chest since he entered the front door was gone. Kane sat up, wiping blood from his lip. The room was a wreck, but it felt clean. Arthur crawled over to his daughter. "Margaret? Daisy!" he cried, using her childhood nickname. The girl stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. The blackness was gone from her eyes. They were blue again, confused and terrified. "Daddy, why is it so messy in here? I had the worst nightmare." Arthur wept, pulling her into a hug. Kane stood up slowly, his body aching. He retrieved his hat from the floor. He walked over to the bowl. The water was black and murky. At the bottom lay the locket, charred and empty. The anchor was broken. The phantom bride had finally gone to her rest. Kane lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline faded. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need. He walked out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door into the Brooklyn night. The storm had passed. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the street lights. It was 3 a.m. Another soul saved, another night survived. Kane Bones turned up his collar and began the long walk to the subway. The city was full of ghosts, and he knew with a heavy certainty that his phone would ring again tomorrow.